Hello, Miss Deborah. How are you this evening? What's up, Ishmael? I see you. Happy Monday, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Hey, Skip. Hello, hello. How are you guys doing this evening? Oh, man. Okay. Hello, Skip. Well, I hope wherever you guys are, it's not as incredibly baking hot and swelteringly humid as it is here. Because it's like, if you've ever done hot yoga before, outside feels like hot yoga right now. It's gross. It's really gross. Wow. So you may have noticed that my lips are lipping today. I actually am experimenting with one of those viral lip stains. I'm not saying which one I'm using right now because one, this is not a promotional video, of course, and two, I'm still experimenting with it. I'm not 100% sure if I love this yet. You're trying to make the whole reading. Miss Deborah, you did it last week. I have all the faith in the world that you can do it again this week. But yeah, I'm trying this, one of the viral lip stains that I've seen on this app, and I've gotten, it's like a pack of 3 different colors. This one I think I like the most so far. I'm still on the fence about the application, and like, if I get really close, you can probably see like on the inside of my lips, it gets kind of darker. Dark Serenity, I am doing well, darling. How are you? Thank you for joining us this evening. So for anyone who is new, welcome, welcome. You have stumbled upon a book reading. And as you can tell, this is the series that we are reading from. This is the author. And you are really late in the game because that's how much book we have left out of all of this. So if you've missed any of my previous readings, or even not just this book, well, I hope all of those things end up working out well for you, Dark Serenity. I really do. Thank you for the hat and the mustache. Thank you. I hope things end up working out the way exactly they're supposed to for you. Anyway, what was I saying? Oh yeah. This book has taken us a while to get through, but if you've missed any of the other books that I've read, you can actually go to, there's a YouTube link on my bio page, and it has to be done. I mean, it's pretty much just tradition at this point, right, Ishmael? But it will take you to YouTube, and you will find my book playlist of all of the books that I've read so far, and you'll also find all of my main Nikki skits, all of that main content I pushed over onto YouTube just in case, you know, this app ever decides to go completely rogue and just either kick me off or disappear or whatever. But anyway, we usually wait till about 5 after to get started on our reads. It gives people a chance to get into their jammies or grab their favorite drink or start making dinner, whatever you end up doing. And then we'll read for about an hour, so we'll go to about 9-ish. A lot of it depends on the size of the chapters. There have been some chapters where we've gotten through like 4, maybe, because they're bigger. And then there have been others where I've blazed through like 6. So it just kind of depends. And forgive me if I clear my throat a lot. I had a quesadilla for lunch earlier today, and I'm pretty sure like I burned, like there's a blister in my throat from some hot cheese. So I'm probably going to be taking more breaks than I normally do. Because it's like right there. I can feel it like right there. Ah. So may you always have quesadilla and never get burned by cheese. Just putting that out there. Oh, good Lord. Oh, thank you. Yes. Oh, that's another thing. I don't like plugging in this kind of stuff on here because it just... But I'm a content creator, so I guess I have to do that. Dark Serenity just subscribed to my YouTube channel. I very, very much appreciate every single subscriber that I get to my YouTube channel because I am so close. I'm so close to 1,000 subscribers. And when I hit 1,000 subscribers, I can do lives on YouTube. So if you're not a subscriber on my YouTube channel yet, please go over and become part of our YouTube family. So I will greatly appreciate it. With that said, let's get started on our story this evening. All right. And for anyone following along, we are in we're in the last book of the 4. But the last book is broken up into 3 books. We are in book 2 of the last book, chapter 5. I'm not putting all of that in a title, so all of these titles, like here and on my YouTube, are all going to look the same. All right, honey. Well, thank you for popping in for a little bit, Dark Serenity. I will be back next week, so hopefully you can join us next week. I would love that. So have a good week. Stay cool out there. All right. Chapter 5. Tell me about weddings, Claire asked as she and Alice carried the nut cake they had made to the feast table, where it would be placed with the festive puddings and sweets. Does everyone have one? Did you? Alice laughed. Not me, she said, but most do. When they reach an age, as Martin and Glennis, when they choose each other and the parents say aye, then we have the hand fasting, always in summer, usually at new moon. Summer. Claire had learned already from Alice that summer is a time of year, the time of sunshine and crops and the birth of young animals. It had been one more thing she had not known. She waited while Alice rearranged some of the other foods in order to make room. Then she set down their cake, and together they decorated its edge with yellow daisies. The village people were gathering. No one, not even the fishermen, was at work today. Babies perched atop their father's shoulders. Claire saw tall Andrus with his parents, the 3 of them scrubbed and dressed in their best clothing. She could see that his mother was not well. She leaned on her son and was flushed with fever, though she smiled and greeted the others. Bryn waved to Claire. She was holding Beth Ann's hand. For once, the 3 little girls were separate, each with their families. Claire could see that beneath her lace-trimmed apron, Bryn's body had thickened with the coming child. Alice thought the time of danger was past and that this one would survive. Oh, what's that? Claire asked, startled at a sound. From the path, several young village men approached and the crowd opened to make way for them. One was blowing into a carved flute. Another kept time on a small drum made from an animal's skin stretched across a hollowed gourd. The third plucked at strings stretched across a long-necked instrument made of wood. Moving in time with the melody, they entered the circle that had opened to admit them as Claire watched from where she and Alice stood at the edge. It's so lovely. Listen, how they make the sounds go together. I've never heard anything like that before. Alice frowned. It's music, child. Have you never heard music? Have you forgotten it? No, never, Claire whispered. I'm quite sure. The hand-fasting ceremony ended as Martin and Glennis kissed each other, and the red ribbon that had been wound around them unfurled, loosened, and freed them. The musicians began again with a louder, rollicking tune, and the villagers cheered and turned to the waiting feast. Claire stood silent, awed by the music, puzzled by the concept of love, and moved by both the solemnity and the celebration of the occasion. When she turned to look through the noisy, laughing throng for Alice, she suddenly noticed lame Einar standing alone on a small rise at the edge of the meadow. While she watched, he adjusted the 2 sticks that supported him, turned, and hobbled slowly away. For a moment, she thought of running over to invite him back, to entice him to join in. But her attention was drawn by the music. Never had she heard such an enticing thing as music. She was sure of it. And now the villagers were choosing partners, forming lines and moving in time to the cheerful melody. Surely Einar would enjoy watching, even if he couldn't do the quick hopping steps that they all seemed to know. They could watch together. But when she looked back for him, it was too late. He had disappeared into the woods. Back to daily tasks after the excitement and holiday of the hand fasting, tall Andras knelt in the field and meticulously tied together the thick branches that would form the body of the mommet. Then, after he had decided on a spot, in the center of the young sprouting crops, he pushed the main branch into the earth and patted the dirt firmly at its base so that it stood upright without tilting. He dressed it, carefully fitting the wide sleeves of a ragged coat over the 2 stick arms. He tied a sash around the middle to hold the coat closed, but loosely, so that the breeze would lift and sway the fabric. He stood back and watched with satisfaction as the cloth moved. The ends of the arm branches, extending from the sleeves, looked like beckoning skeletal hands. Claire, approaching on her way to the stream, watched with a smile. She understood what he was doing, though she had never seen a mommet before. She stopped, watched, and then called to Andras. "Do you have a ribbon? If you had a long ribbon, it would wave in the wind." He shook his head. "I'll bring you one, if you like," she suggested, coming closer. He stood back and looked at his creation. "A ribbon would be good," he acknowledged, "around the neck." Claire laughed. "The neck?" she asked. There was only the gnarled branch end protruding upward from the patched coat. Andras laughed as well. "I'll make the head now," he told her, and showed her the large gourd waiting on the ground. He knelt beside it and with his knife carved a hole at one end. He dug out several inches of the pulpy flesh within, then placed the gourd atop the neck, fitting it down so that it sat firm. Claire could see that it looked, indeed, like a head, and that from a distance the entire mommet would seem a frightening, flapping creature. The crows would surely avoid it, and the crops would be protected. He lifted the yellow gourd off the neck and set it on the ground again. "It needs a face," he told her. She sat on the soft earth and watched him begin to carve. First, he gouged 2 circles near each other in the center of the gourd, then scraped at the rind between and below the eyes to create the impression of a nose. Impulsively, Claire tore some handfuls of grass from the earth and handed them to him. "Hair," she said. He laughed and draped the hair over the gourd. It slid away and he looked around. "Wait," he told her. "I can make it stay." He left her with the gourd lying on the ground and went over to the edge of the woods. As she watched, he found the pine tree he had in mind and pulled a length of one supple branch loose. "Oh, aye," he murmured, "this is good." He brought it back to where she was sitting and showed her the wetness from the torn end, where the bark glistened. He held it for her to sniff the woodsy pine scent. "Alice makes a pillow filled with the needles," she told him. He nodded. He was smearing the oozing resin on the gourd. "Aye, it soothes the sleep," he said. "Look now." He picked up the torn grass and pasted it on the gourd's head, where it settled in tufty clumps, held tight by the sticky sap. They both laughed as he held it up. "Some mommet," Andras said with pride. "Needs a mouth," Claire reminded him. She pictured a grin on the odd creature. "Aye, it does." He bent over it, carving meticulously. She watched as he worked. Now and then he drew back, examined his own efforts, and then leaned forward to correct the shape, to trim the curves. She saw him smooth the mouth edges with his finger. He flicked away some tiny shreds of gourd. "May I see?" she asked him. "Wait." He moved his blade to expanse of yellow rind above the gouged eyes, and she could see him make 3 deep rippled cuts across the broad forehead. He looked at it and laughed in delight. "There," he said. He stood, holding it, and placed it carefully over the wooden neck, easing it down into place. "There," he said again proudly, and turned with a grin to see her reaction. Sorry, guys, give me a second. Ugh. Man, this is going to be a rough read, I can tell. Claire stared. The grotesque face stared back at her. Its forehead was wrinkled by the wide cuts, which made it look puzzled, and the eyes squinted above the twisted nose. The mouth was a tortured smile, a leer. She caught her breath and felt her heart pound. Andres was laughing. She turned to him, horrified, not knowing why, and cheerfully he twisted his own face into a mimicry of the mommet. He thrust his tongue into his cheek, wrinkled his nose, and creased his forehead. He made a chortling sound. The skewed face, the laughter with it, made something flood into Claire's memory, surging upward in her like a wave about to break. She had made that face once and thought it funny. Someone had made it back to her. But why? Who? She pulled herself upward from the place where she had been sitting in the grass so cheerfully a moment before. She felt sick suddenly and began to cry. "I'm sorry," she gasped. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry." Then she turned and ran, sobbing and breathless, down the hillside, as tall Andres stood uncomprehending beside the wretched, ragged stick figure with its bulbous head. High above him, 2 crows wheeled in the sky and cried out. Alice had been busy sorting and separating her dried plants when Claire burst through the door, her face wet with tears, and threw herself onto the bed. It was clear that this was not a thwarted romance or a quarrel with a friend, the usual cause for the weeping of young girls. This was raw and deep. The old woman poured steaming water from the kettle over a few pinches of blue vervain and chamomile, then put the mug of herbal tea into Claire's hands. She watched with concern as the girl sat huddled and shaking in the dim light of the hut. "Something's come back, then," Alice said. "Something cruel." Claire nodded. She took a few shuddering breaths and sipped the soothing drink. "It helps to say it," Alice suggested. Claire looked up at her. "I can't," she said. "It was so close. It was there, so close, and I can feel it still, but I can't grasp what it is. What brung it? Where be you when it comes so close?" "Over on the hillside with Andres. I was helping him build a stick figure to frighten the crows away." "A mommet?" "Yes, that's what he called it. Tall Andres is a good lad. Surely it was nothing he done." Claire hesitated. "I don't think so. I can't remember exactly. We were laughing, and then, well, everything changed. I can't think why." "Something brung it. Want I should ask Andres?" Claire closed her hands around the mug and breathed the tea steam. "I don't know," she whispered after a moment. "I feel so sad." Alice watched her and knew that the herbs in the mug would soothe the panic that had afflicted her, that soon she would calm and likely sleep for a bit. But they would not heal her. It would be hard to heal a girl as desperately wounded as this one. At least once, I always miss. Chapter 6. The good weather days continued. The sun turned the wave tips into sparkling jewels, and the fishermen filled their nets each day with their glistening catch. In tall Andres's field the mommet flapped its loose fabric arms, and the crows, made timid by it, called out harshly and went to other fields, other crops. The gourd head began to rot in the sun and collapse upon itself, oozing and purple like a bruise. A bold starling swooped and grabbed some of the browning grass that had been its hair. One day it fell sideways into the field. When Claire walked past on her way to gather herbs, she saw only the toppled, ruined remains. The memory it had brought her was no longer there. Andres's mother, Elowen, weakened and no longer left her bed. Alice tended her there, holding her head so that she could sip warm liquid made from chopped wild sunflower roots simmered in spring water. The medicine eased her cough, but it was a comfort, not a cure. "She'll not live," Alice told Claire. Claire had learned about death already in her time here, for they had buried an old fisherman earlier, and she had helped Alice wash and wrap the gaunt body before his sons lifted it into the box they had built. The fisherman's death had been sudden, though, in his sleep. Now Claire watched, day by day, as Eowyn drifted in her mind, woke less often, and seemed to shrink. Finally, early one evening, with Andras and his father there, her breath slowed and stopped. The father and son touched her forehead gently as a goodbye and went away. Alice squeezed cloths that she had lifted from the pail of water, handed one to Claire, and together they began to wash the thin body. Clean wrappings were folded nearby, waiting. "The day they brung you from the sea," the old woman said, "I washed you like this. Did you think I would die?" Alice shook her head. "I could see you was strong. You fought me some." She chuckled softly as she patted Eowyn's arm dry and laid it gently back on the bed. "I don't remember." "No, you wasn't yourself yet. It was your sleep self what fought me. Here." She handed Claire a dry cloth, and together they dried and tidied the dead woman, folding her arms finally across her gaunt chest. Alice brushed her thin hair, and they carefully wrapped her. They could hear the two men moving outside, readying the box. "They'll be needing a woman here," Alice said, glancing around the crude hut. The cooking vessels were unwashed, and a blanket thrown across a chair was stained and in need of mending. "Yes," Claire agreed. "Men don't tend houses well, do they?" "Tall Andras is of an age to wed," Alice said pointedly. Alice shrugged. "He should, then." Spam caller, go away. Go away. "He should, then. It's you he wants." Claire knew it to be true. She blushed. "I'm not of a mind to wed," she murmured. Alice didn't hear, or pretended not to. "He'll want sons." "All men do, I expect." It was something Claire had observed in the village. Sons carried on the outside work. They took on the boats and the fields as their fathers grew old. Alice busied herself with tying the cords that held the wrappings firmly in place around Eowyn's remains. Claire, silent now, helped her. She thought how proud Eowyn must have once been to have birthed a strong boy like Andras. They sat back. Their work was finished. In a moment they would call the men, father and son, to lift the woman into her coffin. The village would gather in the morning to place it in the earth. "On that day, the day I tended you," Alice said to Claire, "I saw your wound." "Wound?" "Your belly." Claire placed her hand there protectively. She looked at the ground. "I don't—" she began, and then faltered. "It's a grievous wound. Someone tended it, stitched it up. There are the marks." "I know," Claire whispered. "One day it will come back to your mind, like everything else." "Perhaps. But I fear this, that you will not be able to give birth. I think it has been taken from you." Claire was silent. Alice leaned forward and turned the flame higher in the oil lamp. It was darkening outside. "There are other ways a woman finds worth," she said in a firm, knowing voice. "Yes. Come, we'll bring the men inside to be with her now." They rose and went out into the evening, where tall Andras and his father waited in a light rain, their faces resigned. In her mind, Claire made a list of what was new to her. Colors, of course. She was grateful for knowing them now. The red of hollyberries and the red ribbon of the hand-fasting. She marveled at the vibrancy and vigor of it, and she had come to feel bathed in contentment when the sky was blue, as it was on these late summer days. Sometimes the sea was quiet and blue as well, but most days it churned dark gray-green, with spumes of white blown and of white blown and dissolved in the air. Claire liked that darkness as well, with its relentless motion and mystery, though she blamed the sea for hiding her past in its depths. Yellow she loved for its playfulness. Yellow Wing, her little bird, came to her finger now, and she poked it between the twigs that formed its cage. He hopped onto it and tilted his head at her with a questioning look. She wondered why she had ever been so frightened of birds. They were added to her list of newly learned things, birds and animals of all sorts. She still skirted the cow uneasily when she walked past. She had become fond of lame Einar's sheep, especially the small ones, who frolicked in the tall meadow grass and showed their pink tongues when they bleated in excitement. Einar told her of wolves, but she had not seen one and did not want to. Ever. She took joy in butterflies and scolded the little girls for catching them. "You've ruined it now," she said, looking sadly at the crumpled spotted wings in Bethan's outstretched hand. "It deserved to live and to fly." Together they buried the dead creature, but later she saw the child chasing another. She feared bees and most bugs. "You're like a wee child," Alice said to her, laughing, when Claire backed away nervously from a fat beetle on a bush where they were gathering large leaves of golden seal. Infusion of golden seal eased the sore throat that sometimes afflicted fishermen after long days in the boats. "I've just never seen them before," Claire explained, as she had often, of so many things. Her list included lightning, which astonished her, thunder, which terrified her, and frogs, which made her laugh aloud. A rainbow one morning made her almost faint with delight and surprise. Chapter 7. Claire joined in the harvesting at the end of summer and the rejoicing after. The crops were brought in and stored, and in the fields the birds picked at the strewn leavings. Apples were ripening still, but the early ones were picked and pressed into cider. She could see that the days were shorter now. In summer, the children had played barefoot into the evening, chasing one another until their shadows grew long. The men fished until there were stars, and still the sky did not darken until they brought their catch ashore. Now, though, the air turned brisk late in the afternoon. The sun seemed to topple down to the edge of the horizon and colored it crimson there until it was gulped by the sea and gone. The wind rose then, taking the brown leaves in a whirl from the trees, and smoke wafted from the chimneys of cottages as fires were fed. The smoke carried with it the scent of soups and stews, nourishment for chilly nights. Women unraveled the sweaters their children had outgrown. They rolled the yarn and started again with it, forming new patterns, bright stripes, in larger sizes. Nothing was wasted. Boys carved buttons from bone. Tall Andras gave Claire a fringed shawl that had been his mother's. Most days were still sunlit and warm, but in the evenings she wrapped the soft shawl around her. Lame Einar, seeing how she tied the ends to fasten it closed, created a clasp from willow twigs that he'd soaked to soften, and then twisted it into a curled design. Carefully he attached the two pieces to the green shawl and showed her how to fit them into each other and hold the thick fabric tight together. She noticed one morning, early, that her breath was visible in the cold, clear air. "Like mist," she said to Alice. "Steam," Alice replied. They were on their way to the cottage at the edge of the woods where Bryn lived with her fisherman husband and their little girl. Bethan had burst into their huts just before daybreak, shivering with the cold because she had forgotten her sweater, and breathless with excitement. "My mum's pains have begun, and my dad says come because he wants no part in it. Run back, child, and tell her we'll be there shortly." Alice spoke in a calm voice while she rose, prodded the fire, and reached for her clothing. "You'll come too, won't you, Water Claire?" Bethan begged. Claire had sat up and yawned. "I will. Go tell your dad he's a big baby himself." Claire knew Bethan's father, that he was gentle and loving, but men were not good at this. The little girl giggled. Claire swung her bare feet to the floor and winced at the cold. She reached for the knitted socks that Alice had made for her. "Go now," Scat, she said, and Bethan, gleeful, left the hut and scampered back along the lane. Yellow Wing, whose cage had been brought inside at the end of summer, shifted on his perch and chirped. Alice rolled a leaf tightly and slipped it between the bars for him to nibble. Claire finished dressing. She fashioned her leather sandals over the warm socks and watched as the old woman gathered things from the shelves in the corner. Suddenly, watching, she shuddered. "Why do you need a knife?" Alice placed the knife carefully beside the corked containers of herbal infusions. She rolled them all in a soft leather skin and placed the bundle inside her bag. She added a large sack of clean folded cloths to the bag and pulled its drawstring tight. "Some say it eases pain to lay a knife beneath the bed." "Is it true?" Alice shrugged. "Likely not, but if the person thinks it, then the thinking eases the pain." She wrapped her thick knitted shawl around her and hefted the bag over her shoulder. "And I need the knife for the cord." Claire pulled her own shawl tight and fastened it with the willow clasp. "Bring the lamp," Alice told her. Together they hurried along the path. Claire held the lamp high, and it made the way easier. But the sky itself was lightening now. The moon was a thin sliver against the gauzy gray of earliest morning. Bryn's child would be a daylight baby. They could see when they arrived that Bethan in her excitement had dashed about in the shadowy dawn and wakened her friends. Now all three little girls, still in their sleeping garments, were giggling nervously in the small room where Bryn groaned and twisted on the bed. Alice firmly shooed them back outdoors. "Don't come back till the sun is full up, and then you come with your arms filled with flowers from the meadow to welcome the babe." "They'll find some dried asters still," she told Claire, "and late goldenrod, and it will keep them out from underfoot." The coming baby's father was nowhere in sight. Alice had told Claire that men were frightened by birthing. She had watched lame Einar, though, help his ewes to bear young early in the spring. He was both firm and gentle with them, and unafraid. Einar hadn't minded that she stood watching when she came upon the scene. It was the first time she had ever seen him smile, when he unfolded the damp legs of a newborn and set it wobbling on its feet so that it could nudge its mother for milk. "They don't really need me," he told her gruffly. "They can birth alone unless there's trouble." "But it's nice you're here to help," Claire said. Einar had shrugged, patted the rump of the nursing ewe, and reached for his sticks to hobble away. Claire watched him for a moment after he turned his back. Then she too walked on. But that had been months before. The spring lambs were tall now, playful, and thick with wool. Einar was no longer so shy with her. Once he startled her by making a harsh cackling sound, suddenly, and then a series of soft clucks. She looked at him in surprise. "You asked me once, could I do other birds? That's a pheasant," he explained. Then he looked up at something very large, soaring above the sea. He gave a long, hoarse call. "Black-backed gull," he said. Now he let her help when he gathered the sheep in for the evening. Together they counted. He had never lost one to wolves, he told her, and was proud of that. He loved the new lambs. "Wash the knife," Alice directed her, and her thoughts returned to the cottage, where Bryn gasped and gathered herself now as the child emerged. Claire saw it was a girl. She heard it cry as she turned and dipped the knife into the water that simmered on the fire. The blade was hot when she wiped it carefully dry with a clean cloth. "Don't cut Bryn," she implored suddenly. Alice frowned at her. "No need to cut the mother," she said brusquely. She knotted a string around the pulsing cord. The baby waved a fist in the air and wailed. "Sun's rising," Alice said to Bryn, "and you've got a fine girl." She waited a moment, then reached for the knife that Claire held, took it, and separated the newborn from its mother with a careful cut. Bryn was watching wearily and smiling. Suddenly Claire stepped forward without thinking, toward the baby that Alice was wrapping now in a cloth, and cried out, "Don't take it from her!" Alice frowned. "Take what? What's troubling you, girl? Give Bryn her baby!" Alice looked puzzled. She leaned forward and placed the swaddled infant in Bryn's arms. "And what did you think I was going to do?" Put the child out for the wolves? Of course it goes to its mum. Look there. Wee as she is, she knows what to do. Like the lamb wobbling forward to suckle, Bryn's baby turned its head against its mother's warm skin and its mouth opened, searching. Claire stared at it. Then she began to sob and stumbled out of the cottage into the dawn. Behind her, Alice, her face folded into puzzlement and concern, began to replace her birthing tools into the woven bag. The new mother dozed while her tiny daughter nuzzled and sucked. Outside in the distance, the little girls were moving about in the gradually lightening meadow, their arms filled with flowers. But for Claire, who stood on the path weeping, the sunrise, perhaps all sunrises to come, was ruined by memory and loss. Well, that was an intense chapter. Good Lord, my throat. For anyone who doesn't know, I'm not sick. I got burned by hot quesadilla cheese at lunch today. So I'm pretty sure I have a blister in my throat from the cheese. You know. Anyway, chapter 8. Haltingly, pausing to weep, Claire told her remembered story to Alice. Astonished, the old woman asked to examine her scar. Her gnarled hands touched the raised pink flesh and followed the map of it with one finger. "Aye," she said, "this is what I saw the day you came, and I knew you'd had a terrible wound, but never did I see until now that it's the size to remove a child. Imagine! To cut a woman like that. Or a girl. You was just a girl. The pain would have been so fierce. It would have killed you." "No," Claire explained. "I felt nothing when they cut. Before, there was pain, like what Bryn had, with the squeezing of the baby. But when they cut, I felt only pressure, the pushing of the knife, no pain." Alice shook her head as if in disbelief. "How could that be, then?" "There were special medicines, drugs. They took away pain." "White willow brings relief," Alice murmured, "but not for cutting. We have no herbs for that." "I felt nothing." "And what of the blood?" Alice again touched the scar. Her finger, its knuckle bent and thickened by age, ran the length of the wound. "I've seen wounds like this. A fisherman caught and ripped apart by the gaff. A hunter clawed and torn open by an animal. I've been called to tend them, but I can do naught but soothe and comfort. The blood pulses away, and they die from it, from the blood and the pain. They scream from the pain and then weaken as the blood flows. Their eyes die first." The old woman's own eyes seemed to look into the distance, thinking of the terrible things she had seen and could not heal. Claire looked down herself at the scar. "I couldn't see. My eyes were covered." She shuddered a bit as the memory of the mask came to her. "But I felt them cut. And you're right. Of course there must have been blood. They had tools, I think, to deal with that. I remember a small sound." She thought, and then tried to reproduce it. "Zzzt. And I smelled a burning smell. I think it—" Alice, puzzled, waited for her to continue. Claire sighed. "I think they had something that we don't have here. Electricity. It's hard to explain. I think they had an electric tool that burned and sealed the blood vessels. Zzzt, zzzt." Alice nodded, as if it made sense to her. "I burn a wound, sometimes, or a snake bite. I use a fire stick to kill the poison. Not for bleeding, though. Not for a huge wound like this one." Claire drew her clothing across her scar, covering it, and the two of them sat together in silence, one with her new and troubling memories, the other one puzzling over what had happened to the girl, and why. "I must find him," Claire whispered finally. "Aye, you must." "How?" Alice stayed silent. She told Bryn. Watching the woman hold and tend her infant one afternoon, Claire confided in her and described the return of the memories. Bryn listened with shock and sorrow. She clutched her own baby tighter as Claire answered her horrified questions. Neither of them was aware that just outside the cottage, beside the door that had been left partially open for fresh autumn air, the little girls, wide-eyed, were listening. They scampered away to tell others. A terrible secret, Beth Ann called it, enjoying the attention she received when she retold the embellished story. Water Claire had had a baby. Yes, young as she was. No husband at all. And they took the baby from her. Just stole it away, and she never saw it since. The secret was murmured throughout the community. Older women lowered their eyes in sympathy. Many of them had lost children in cruel ways, and they knew what strong, lasting grief came with such a loss. Younger ones, jealous of the pretty stranger, tossed their heads in judgment. No husband! Wanton thing! We suspected something like that. So she was tossed out of where she lived. Glennis, who had welcomed Claire's attention at the hand-fasting ceremony in early summer, now smoothed her skirt smugly over her newly rounded belly. "I'll have Alice come to midwife me when my time comes," she said with a toss of her head, "but I don't want her." Tall Andras, his face set in hard lines, turned away when he saw her. "Is something wrong?" Claire asked him, puzzled by his cold look. He had always been so friendly. "Is it true, what they say?" "Who? And what is it they're saying?" "Everyone. That you've had a child and no husband." Claire stared at him. The knowledge was still so new to her that it still seemed secret. She had yet to think it all through. It was still there were still fragments. Some, though from describing it to Alice she remembered the birth now, clearly and with horror. But child? She had no sense, yet, of a child. Only something small and newly birthed. "It was different where I lived. There weren't weddings. And yes, I gave birth." She found herself speaking very tersely to him. She was angered. "You can't understand. I was selected to give birth. It was an honor. I was called birth mother." He raised his chin and looked with a kind of contempt. "You live here now, and you're stained." "Stained? What are you talking about?" "Women who couple in the field like animals. They have a stain to them. No one wants them after." Oh, she understood now what he meant. She had watched the sheep mating. Einar had had to explain it to her, how it created the lambs. He had laughed, finding it strange that she knew nothing of the process. That has nothing to do with me," she told Andras defiantly. "Or with me," he said coldly. He turned his back and resumed his stacking of wood. Claire watched for a moment, then continued striding on, but her morning was tainted by the encounter. Later, troubled, she told Alice of it while they were having lunch. "It's the way here," Alice explained. "Foolish, mayhap, but it has always been so. Girls must come to the hand-fasting untouched, or pretend to be. Otherwise no one wants them." Alice shrugged and chuckled. "People learn to overlook. Sounds to me as if Andras was hopeful to have you. He'll overlook, with time, if you don't remind him." "Huh." Claire stood. She fed a piece of spinach to Yellow Wing, who hopped happily back and forth on his perch. Then she scraped the leavings from the plates into the bucket. "I don't care about Andras, and I never wished to wed." "You didn't," she pointed out. Alice grinned. "I was a willful girl," she said. "Willful?" "Some said wild." Now Alice laughed aloud. "And wanton." Claire found that the laughter was making her own anger subside. Looking at Alice, wrinkled and bent, it was hard to imagine her as a willful, wild girl. But in the unrestrained laughter Claire could hear a hint of the carefree creature she must have once been. The children, curious about what seemed a mystery, for people spoke of it in whispers, but too young to judge her, were open with their questions to Claire. They were there on a bench, on the beach, gathering driftwood to dry for the fireplace. The wind was sharp and snapped at Claire's skirt. "Did it grow in your belly, like my mum's?" Bethan asked. Claire nodded, resigned to their knowing. She added a bent stick to the pile. "Were it a boy?" Delwith's eyes were wide. Claire nodded again. "Yes," she said, "a male." She startled herself. Why had she called it that? Everyone knew a baby was either a girl, like Bethan's new sister, or a wee boy. Why had she said that odd word, male, as if she had given birth to a creature of woods or fields? "Where did it go, then, your male?" Solemn little Ira looked worried. "Who took it?" Claire smiled to reassure the child. "Someone else needed it," she explained, "just as your mum needs these pieces of wood. Let's drag that big one over here and see if we're strong enough to break it, shall we?" "I'm strong. Look at me, how strong I am. As strong as a boy, as a male." The children strutted and shouted as they ran about in the wet sand. Claire glanced toward the high bank that bordered the beach and saw Einar watching. He balanced a wooden yoke across his wide shoulders, and 2 buckets hung level from either side. He was coming from the spring where he got fresh water. With his shoulders bearing the weight, he was able still to use his walking sticks. Now, seeing her watching, he lifted one hand and waved to her. Claire waved back and smiled. "So," she thought, "there's one young man who doesn't think me stained. Or is it that I'm now ruined, as he is?" She watched him make his way along the path, his feet dragging, one after the other. Beside her, in the sand, the laughing children imitated Einar, dragging their feet and limping dramatically, and then watching the furrowed ruts they made fill with seawater and smooth over. Chapter 9 will probably be the last chapter for the night. Hopefully it's a little bit of a longer chapter. I don't like it when I don't take for a whole hour for you guys, but it is what it is. Chapter 9. Winter descended suddenly, with bone-chilling cold. The damp, raw wind swept in from the ocean and entered through cracks in the walls of the hut. It made the fire flicker and hiss. Claire wore a thick furred vest that Alice had stitched for her from an animal hide, and warm boots from the same hide, laced with sinew. She accompanied Alice one morning to Bryn's cottage, where the baby girl, now named Ellen, was swaddled in layers of woven cloth and warmed in her cradle by wrapped stones made hot in the fire. Alice chuckled after listening to the shrill cry of the infant. "Summer babies fare better," she told Bryn, "but this one sounds to be strong." Bryn poured tea into thick mugs. Outside the wind blew, and on the floor near the fire little Bethan, humming tunelessly, sorted acorns into families. Claire excused herself and slipped away. Outside, she wrapped her shawl tightly over the fur vest and pulled her thick knitted hat down to protect her ears. She started up the hill, following the deserted path as it wound among the wind-tossed trees. No one was about. The cold weather was keeping people indoors. But perhaps, she thought, Einar would be in the meadow, tending his creatures, and would welcome her company. Climbing, she held her mittened hands to her mouth and breathed into them for warmth. Her feet slipped now and then on mud frozen to ice. It was hard for Claire to understand seasons. Her returning memory had told her nothing of the way the leaves in summer showed their undersides as a storm approached, then withered and dropped when the nights were chill. Now there was the cold, and she could not remember it. She had never had a coat before, or shawl. She was sure of that. And rain. It had been new to her in summer, and now, with the cold, it was mixed with spits of ice. And who was to guess what might follow? Each day came as a surprise, though Alice, realizing, tried to prepare her and explain. Claire knocked on the door of the wood-slatted shed where lame Einar lived, but there was no answer. She pushed the door open, peeked in, and saw that the ashes of his fire were still hot. Wisps of smoke drifted from the chimney and disappeared with the wind into the gray sky. He would be up in the field, she knew. She closed the door tight, pulled her shawl closer around her, and climbed the path. She found him rubbing salve into the leg of a sheep that had caught itself in a thorny bush. "Here, help hold him still, would you? He keeps pulling away." Claire wrapped her arms around the neck of the impatient creature and tried to soothe him by murmuring meaningless sounds. "Shh, shh," she said, as she had heard Bryn whisper to the baby when she cried. She leaned her head against the matted fleece of the sheep's neck. It felt like a pillow, though its smell was strong. There. Einar released the leg, and the sheep shook itself and pulled loose from Claire's grasp. It bounded away through the high, dry grass, and she could hear the nasal bleats of greeting from its flock. He looked at her and said, "You're cold." Claire laughed at him because he had said the obvious. She was shivering and breathing again into her own cupped, mittened hands. "Come down to my shed," he told her. He looked out over the flock, saw that they were huddled together, heads hunched in low, out of the sleet. Then he went down the path and she followed. She sat on the heap of skins that he used for sleeping while he poked ashes into a red glow and then added a thick piece of oak branch. She could feel the warmth expand. "Tell me why you've come out on a foul day like this," he asked her. She hesitated, uncertain how he would react. Finally, she said carefully, "They tell me you climbed out once." He glanced over, then turned back to the fire and rearranged it a bit, though it seemed to Claire unnecessary. She thought that perhaps he simply needed to look away. I did," he acknowledged. "Do you want to know the why of it?" "The how. I want to know the how. I look at the cliff, and it looms there, unclimbable." Einar sighed. He rose with an effort from where he knelt on the ground, then moved over to sit beside her on the skins. They both stared at the fire. "I best tell you the why first, so you understand." Claire nodded, knowing she would need to tell him her own why when the time came. Sorry about that. Whew. Spatters of sleet tapped against the roof of the shed, but they were warm inside. "I never knew my mum," he said. "She died when she birthed me. Alice came, they said, and helped, but I was big, and she labored too long and bled, and she died. It happens sometimes." Claire nodded. Alice had told her that it did. She remembered how interested Alice had been, hearing her tell her own story of the cutting. "It'd be different here," Alice had said. "My father was a fisherman, and he was out with the boats. It was this time of year, with the cold and the wind. He likely had a bad time of it, too. But he was a hard man, my father, strong, used to the weather." He shrugged. "As I am," he added. "But you're not hard, Einar." "Hardened to the weather, I am. I must be, for the creatures." She knew he meant his flock of sheep. "I don't feel the cold as you do," he told her. "You've always been here. You've learned to live with it." They sat silently for a moment. Then he began again to talk. "They say he came in from the sea that evening and emptied his nets and tied his boat. All who saw him fell silent, for no one wanted to be the one to tell him that his son was birthed healthy, but his wife was already stiffening and being readied for a coffin." He looked away, then said, "They say he had wanted a son, but not the one that took his wife." Outside, a branch broke in the wind, skittered across the dooryard of his shed, and slammed against the wall. Claire could picture the fisherman arriving home in weather just like this to find a squalling infant and a wife turned blue and lost. "It was Alice kept him from flinging me into the fire. Others came and held him down. He roared into the night, they say, cursing all flesh and the wind and the gods, even cursing the sea that be his livelihood. He was a hard man to start, they say. My mum, She softened him a bit, and when she was gone he turned to stone, and the stone had an edge to it, sharpened against me, for I had killed her. But it wasn't, Claire began, then stopped. He hadn't heard her. Others raised me, village women. Then, when I was old enough, he took me back, said it was time for me to pay for what I had done. What did he mean, old enough? How old were you? He thought. 6 years, mayhap? Oh, 1 second. There we go. 6 years, mayhap? My front teeth had fallen out. She shuddered at the thought of a little boy expected to atone for his mother's death. I didn't know him. It was as if a stranger took me. I went to his cottage, for they said I must, and that night he gave me food and drink, and a blanket to wrap around me as I slept on a pile of straw. In the morning he kicked me awake before it was light, and told me he would make a fisherman of me, for I owed him. After that, every day, until I was growed, I went with him to the boat, and on the boat out to the sea. He never spoke a soft word, never told me about the kinds of leaves or creatures, or pointed to the stars in the sky, never sang a song to me, or held my hand, just kicked me across the deck if I be clumsy, laughed when I be twisted in the ropes and sliding, pure froze in the water that washed aboard, slapped me in the head when the sea was rough and I puked over the side. He hoped I would wash overboard and drown. He told me that. He made me climb the mast to untangle the lines, and he laughed when my hands slid from the salty wood and I fell onto the deck. When I broke my arm, he kept me on the sea all day, hauling nets, then sent me to Alice that night and told her to have it fixed by morning or he'd break the other. You should have killed him, Claire said in a low voice. He didn't speak for a moment. Then he said, I had already killed my mother. He stood suddenly, leaning on his stick. He went to the door, cracked it open, and breathed the wind. She was afraid he was going to go out into the bitter cold, that telling her his past had now forced him to punish himself in some way. But after a moment he pulled the door tightly closed and came back. He sat down again, leaning his stick against the wall, and took several deep breaths. I growed very strong, he said. I know. I growed taller than my father, and so strong. I could have picked him up and flung him into the sea, but I never thought to do that. I stayed silent. I obeyed him. I cooked for him like a wife and washed his clothes, and was a wife in other ways too terrible to mention. I made myself into stone. I willed myself deaf when he cursed me, and blind to the look of hatred in his eyes. I waited. Waited for what? To be old enough, strong enough, brave enough to leave, to climb out. What went wrong? She asked him. Not in the climbing out. I trained for it. I was ready. I knew I could do it, and I did. It went wrong after. Einar moved one damaged foot slightly, staring at it. His tone was bitter. Then it changed and became more gentle and curious. Why do you be asking me this? I must try, Claire told him. I must try to climb out. He stared at her. No woman ever done so, he said. I must. I have a child out there, a son. I must find him. She had known he wouldn't be scornful, for that was not his nature. She had thought, though, that he might laugh at the impossibility of her plan, but he did not. As she realized that he already knew of the child, that he had heard the talk of it. He looked at her thoughtfully for a moment, then said, Push against this. He extended his arm toward her, held his hand out upright as if to shove something away. Like this? Claire held her hand up against his. He nodded. Push. She did, summoning her strength to try to move his hand, to bend his arm. It was firm, rigid, immobile. Her own arm trembled with the effort. Finally, she gave up. Her hand dropped back into her lap. It ached. Einar nodded. You're strong, at least in the arms. Can you climb? Claire pictured the vertical rock cliff that hung over the village and hid the sun for half the day. She shook her head. I climb the path up to the meadow where you keep the sheep. You've seen me do it often enough. And sometimes, gathering herbs, I go up into the woods near the waterfall. I never get tired, and it's steep there, but I know that's not what you mean. You must start to harden yourself. I'll show you. It won't be easy. You must want it. I do want it, Claire said. Her voice broke. I want him. Einar paused and thought, then said, It'd be better, I think, to climb out in search of something instead of hating what you're leaving. It will be a long time, he told her, to make you ready. I know. Not days or weeks, he said. I know. Mayhap it will take years, he told her. For me, it was years. Years? He nodded. How do I start? Claire asked. All right. That will bring us to the end of this evening's read. Thank you guys so much for bearing with my voice. I know I cleared my throat a lot today, so I'm sorry about that. So, I hope you guys have a fantastic week. Again, if you happen to be in a place that is dealing with a massive heat wave, please stay hydrated. Please stay indoors. Please try not to be out if you can help it. And if you work outside, please be careful. Please be safe. Hydrate. Take breaks. You know, all the things. All the things. But until then, I will see you guys next Monday. Same time, same place. 8 to 9-ish. And hopefully by then my burnt throat will be better. And I won't be clearing my throat so much. So, I will see you guys next week. Have a fantastic week. Mwah. Love you. Bye.